Republicans, motivated by a lie, we must remember, are not only suppressing the vote where they can, they are finding ways around the very last line of defense that ultimately prevented Donald Trump from stealing the 2020 election. One part of the bill Georgia's governor signed into law yesterday allows the state's Republican-led legislature to take over control of elections from those elected to safeguard them. People like Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. Remember how firm he stood against a dangerous president trying to change the election with no evidence or right to do so? This conversation, this one coming up, could have gone a lot differently if it was, say, someone chosen by Republican lawmakers.
The 2,236 and absentee ballots, I mean, they're all exact numbers that were done by accounting firms, law firms, etc. And even if you cut them in half, and cut them in half again, it's more votes than we need.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
It's not social media. I don't care about social, but I couldn't care less. Social media is big tech. Big tech is on your side, you know. I don't even know why you have a side, because you should want to have an accurate election. And you're a Republican.
We believe that we do have an accurate election.
Joining us now is Pennsylvania's Attorney General Josh Shapiro. Mr. Attorney General, I listened to that conversation between former President Trump and Brad Raffensperger with a certain amount of anguish, knowing that the landscape has just changed for Brad Raffensperger, right? This new Georgia election law, we focused a lot on the public-facing things, like you can't give people food and water when they're waiting in line for 8 hours. The absentee early voting is being curtailed. But there are deeply pernicious things happening behind the scenes in the election machinery for the state. Among them, removing the Secretary of State from the state election board chair, allowing the state election board to delay certification, allowing the state election board to replace local election officials. When you read those, what runs through your mind?
Well, Alex, it makes me angry. It makes me angry to hear that conversation that you just played between the former president and the Secretary of State. It makes me angry that we have elected officials who seem to want to just suck up to the former president as opposed to following the law, that they'd rather disenfranchise voters than allow their voices to be heard. So I'm angry. And I will tell you, I'm the Pennsylvania Attorney General. We're talking about this matter in Georgia, and I think it's important that we are, because this can happen anywhere. In fact, it happened here in Pennsylvania a few years ago when we had a Republican governor. They passed voter ID as a means to try and disenfranchise voters and prop up Republican elected officials. Thankfully, now in Pennsylvania, even though many of the same bills that have just passed into law in Georgia have been introduced here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, thankfully, we have a Democratic governor here who will veto it. We have to make sure that we maintain that. But it's important for us to note that this can happen anywhere. They're trying to take away the power from the people and instead vest it with themselves, the insider politicians. That's wrong. It's unjust, and we have to fight back against it.
I mean, I think a lot of people remember in the days and weeks that followed the election, these singular Republicans who stood in the way of their party that otherwise wanted to overturn the results of the election. I mean, you know, Brad Raffensperger was not a name anybody knew until it was revealed that he was basically Atlas holding up the democracy in the state of Georgia. And there were similar people in Michigan. I remember in Pennsylvania, there was real movement inside the Republican legislature to do away with the results. So now that these heroes have basically been put in the crosshairs, I mean, what are the implications for free and fair elections? I mean, do you ultimately think these efforts are going to be successful from a legal standpoint?
Well, first off, let's just take a moment and acknowledge those heroes, those secretaries of state, and people like Al Schmidt in Philadelphia, a Republican who ran our elections and withstood the pressures coming from the Trump administration, the attorneys general and the governors who stood up and beat back those attempts to make sure that certain votes didn't count, which was the goal of the former president. But of course, we made sure that they counted here. I am deeply concerned. The conduct that is happening in Georgia, the efforts that are happening in Harrisburg, our state capital, are designed to make sure that certain people's voices don't count. And let me be very clear. They're not trying to make people who look like me not count. They're trying to make our black and brown communities not count. As Stacey Abrams properly said, this is Jim Crow 2.0. We have to be vigilant against this. And the way we can do that is by making sure we've got people, or heroes as you call them, in these positions of authority to make sure that every single legal vote counts, regardless of the outcome. We should be about enfranchisement, not disenfranchisement. Unfortunately, many of these Republicans across the country recognize seemingly that their path to victory is not by listening to the people and letting the people's voices be heard, but by silencing the people and limiting those who can participate in the process.
You know, up until this moment, Republicans would say, oh, these tricks are the same ones that Democrats play when they have power. But the reality is H.R. 1, the bill that's going to the Senate, this Voting Rights Act, is trying to strip partisanship from the electoral process, right? We look at gerrymandering, right? Democrats have now reached the point where they're like, just take the drawing of districts out of political hands. Make it nonpartisan, because it has been so bastardized over the course of the last 2 decades, largely by Republicans. I guess I wonder if you think elections are going to be the new redistricting. I mean, are we now at a stage where in the way that districts are gerrymandered, elections are going to be gerrymandered because the Republican Party is injecting so much partisanship into the process?
Well, they're certainly trying to gerrymander it. I think it's on us to make sure that doesn't happen. The best way to do that is by electing people who are not going to participate in this sham of a process, electing people who are going to protect your right to vote, from governors on down. That's critically important. When it comes to gerrymandering, just look at the last few years here in Pennsylvania. We needed our state Supreme Court to step in and say to the Republicans that those congressional districts that you drew a few years back, they were gerrymandered in an unconstitutional way. And when they drew the maps in a fair way in districts that were compact and contiguous, then all of a sudden we got an equal balance in our Congress. And what did the Republicans do in the wake of that? They put forth a constitutional amendment to now gerrymander the courts, to try and get the courts to be in a position where they could use them to overturn the will of the people. We need to speak up about this. I'm so grateful that you're spending time on this on air. This is something that impacts every single American. As I said before, Georgia may be in the news today, but this is happening in Pennsylvania. It's happening in other states, and we've got to be vigilant against it.
Let me ask you, because you're the Attorney General, how strong is your belief that the courts, which have changed in terms of makeup under the last president who greatly reshaped the judiciary, how confident are you that the courts can remain the last bulwark for free and fair democracy?
Well, here's what I know. 19 times before last November's election, Donald Trump and his enablers went to court to try and make it harder for people to vote. And 22 times after Election Day was over, they went to court to make sure that certain people's votes didn't count. I tell you that because we went to court to defend Pennsylvanians, and the courts held. Judges who were elected as Republicans, judges who were elected as Democrats here in Pennsylvania, they did the right thing. They upheld the law. Republican-appointed judges at the federal level, Democratic-appointed judges at the federal level, didn't matter. They upheld the law, and they pushed back on the lawless former president and his enablers. And they said, you know what, we're going to make sure that the people's voices are heard, that the will of the people is respected. I was pleased when we went to court to know that at the end of the day, the judges would uphold the rule of law. And that is something we need to celebrate in this country, no matter how hard the president and his enablers worked to abuse and destroy the institutions of our democracy. They held. Now, a lot of damage happened. There's a lot of people who think Joe Biden wasn't duly elected. There's a lot of people who still think that voter fraud was a huge issue in Pennsylvania. By the way, we had 3 cases, and all 3 of them, those people tried to commit fraudulent acts to vote for Donald Trump. And I've prosecuted voter fraud. I know what it is when I see it. But there is real damage that's been done to our democracy, even though our institutions have been held. And we have got to make sure that we repair that by doing some truth telling and by making sure that the right people are in positions of authority to defend your voice and your vote.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.